Welcome to In the Demo, a show about the stories that get told about groups, how those stories got made, what we think those stories get wrong, and why it matters. You hosts? Farah Bostic is the founder and head of research and strategy of The Difference Engine, a strategic insights consultancy focused on helping business leaders make decisions. Adam Piano, author and brand consultant and managing director of brand strategy at Arizona State University. You are now in the demo.
I'm Adam Piano, Generation X still.
I'm Farah Bostic, been old for a minute generation.
Ah, that's a good one. I like this.
Thank you.
The nicknames thing is funny based on what we're going to be talking about today, because I thought potentially based on the article we were reading together, I thought maybe we had a listener who found us who had referenced some of your formerly lead-off nicknames in the top of her article. But it turns out you have a different theory.
Yeah, I think she might be one of the co-authors of the generation nicknames I've been co-opting, because she worked at BuzzFeed for a while. And I feel like that's where I saw all of these nicknames.
It's the Millennial Ouroboros. Like, are we influencing her or is she influencing us?
Oh, God, yes. Influencers. A whole other topic. But yes, we were talking about Anne Helen Peterson, who is one of my favorite Substackers.
Yes. You introduced me to her, and I've been enjoying kind of her back catalog now based on this article.
Yes.
She has a theory about millennials getting old and what that means. You could hear the question mark on the word theory. I'm not sure she really closes the loop on the theory, but she has a lot of great thinking and a lot of great data points. I'm just not sure she gets all the way to bright on, here's what I think the ultimate either causation or solution is.
Yeah, I think we should probably just go ahead and jump to like what she's arguing in the piece. So this is a relatively recent post on her Substack, which is called Culture Study, on millennials getting old and kind of what that experience is like and what that means. And we should also say that she has written books about the kind of the part of the millennial narrative that is about being the unluckiest generation, as then got used by like Michael Hobbs and other people. And so that's really her orientation, is the Great Recession knocked everything back for millennials, and they're off track, unlucky, never going to catch up, very much in the first generation to be worse off than their parents storyline. And that's her kind of orientation about the millennial experience. Apart from, other more fun topics like Peloton and Instagram and trad wives and other things that she's been writing about of late that are great pieces that you absolutely should read. And so I think the first thing is that there's kind of this argument that like there is a part of them. So some millennials are experiencing getting older as actually as kind of a separation from millennialness, of like they've now progressed into the life stage where the ideas about they don't own homes, they're not married, they don't have kids, they haven't hit these kind of adulting mile markers are no longer true. Like they're past 40, and so they do own a home, and they do have a good job, and they do have some retirement savings, and they do have a partner, and they may or may not have kids. Right. And so like, am I still a millennial? I think is kind of the midlife identity crisis that group of millennials are having. And then she identifies a second group who like, we're never going to get there, right? The ones who are kind of stuck in the narrative of not being able to afford a home, not having retirement savings, not having hit various mile markers. Right. And they feel like exhausted, right? So they feel old because it's exhausting to never be where you want to be in
they're on a life treadmill. It's when's it going to stop? Like how does that get resolved?
Exactly. The third group is a weird one because they're the Exennial, Oregon Trail, whatever generation, which she situates herself in, which is interesting because I'm fairly certain that she's born in like 81, 82.
Hmm.
And so she's not an Exennial. She's a millennial by her own definition that she offers us at the beginning of the piece. She's a
Yeah.
millennial. But maybe she identifies, since we're using that that kind of construct for talking about this, maybe she identifies as an Exennial. It's very unclear to me. But she frames that group as basically always having looked at millennials as a bit, well, she says as young. I might be judgmental as an Exennial and say immature. Like maybe that's what she's trying to get at, is like
Mhm.
some kind of set of just like these narratives never really applied to that group of people, or they never adopted it as their own, and so they look at people who are complaining about those things and go, whatever, kid, get over it. And so that group of people that she wants to at least partially incorporate into millennials have always, by comparison, felt old because I'm not sure. Like that's the one where I'm a little bit like, I don't get it. So because people who were born before 1981, let's stipulate, sort of accepted, I guess, that this is what the workforce was going to be like, that this is what housing prices were going to be like, that this is what the economy was going to be like. We just sort of got on with it. And that made us more grown up than millennials who were like, no, I should be able to afford things when I'm young. And I should not be radically in debt, and I shouldn't be told that, I'm going to be worse off than my parents or whatever. It's unclear to me why that third group gets to be in the group at all, because they're not millennials anyway. But
there's that. That's a big challenge. Yeah.
Yes. But I think it's just sort of this like, I've always been in the real world, not expecting things to get better. And you guys over here have been agitating for things to get better. And now you finally figured out that like either it did or it's not going to. And so, that expression of oldness, like, and like to some degree, which is why I said the been old for a minute generation is like, I don't know, like I'm 46 years old. Do I feel significantly different than I did at 36? Honest to God, not especially. I gained a bunch of weight during the pandemic. That's about as much as I can say feels different from then.
You don't know if
to
that's
now.
age related or something else. Yeah.
Right. And then apart from that, I don't feel like a particularly different person. And to be fair, by 36, my career was pretty sorted out. I made a decent amount of money. I have debt, but I don't think of that as unusual. And so, student debt is what I'm thinking about here. And so like, whatever, that'll get paid off. It's fine. And like, I accept that this is a stupid sort of credit regime in which continuing to just make timely monthly payments on my student loan debt is good for my credit, and
Right.
that paying it off all at once would actually be bad for my credit. It's infuriating, but I understand that that's how the game is played. And so whatever, just service the debt. And then like, in the same way that I did with the car, which is now thankfully paid off, right? You just
Amen.
deal with it, you pay it, and then you're done. But like, so I think there's a certain amount of, and you see this in tropes now about Gen Xers where like, they don't really accept the idea of having got old. Like the joke is that Gen Xers were 35 when they were 20, and now that they're 55, they're still 35. Like that they're still kind of living like a 35-year-old, that they don't really accept this kind of whatever, that you get past a certain age and you're supposed to start wearing sweater sets and pearls. This, by the way, is another meme on the internet, is like the first Father of the Bride movie with Diane Keaton and Steve Martin. And like, they were supposed to be 40 or 45 or something like that
They
when
look
their
like
daughter gets married.
180.
And they look like 180. It's like,
I
this
know.
like, okay, now I live in a colonial and I wear sweater sets and suits in my living room. Right? Like, first of all, who did that then? But yes, so I do, to get back to the original thing, like I do think that there is like a mismatch between what people are presented with in popular culture and what they're experiencing day to day. And I think that is also true of this narrative. And like, to some degree, that's what we've been talking about all along, is like a narrative focused on white, upwardly mobile, college bound kids.
Yeah.
And that then like it's problematic when we have the turn from the next greatest generation to oops, like the terrible thing happened and it was the Great Recession. Arguably, the other arguable turning point is 9/11 and the Forever Wars. Like, there were lots of turning points. I think what is interesting to me about the structure of the millennial narrative as told by a lot of millennials who fit the narrative, and I think Anne Helen Petersen by and large fits the narrative,
I think so.
is like there is this odd, and I feel like we maybe have talked about this before, there's also this odd sense that like 9/11, the Great Recession, the pandemic happened to their generation and nobody else's.
Yeah. It is always in the Wikipedia style description of millennials. It is always like millennials who experienced blah, 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 blah. But that doesn't show up in the Gen X definition at all.
No.
It's like, I also was alive during those things and they were traumatic.
Yes. And I think, you even see like, I've been guilty of this as well. Like, we've done research with Gen Zers where they seem to be kind of obsessed. I mean, they're not affluent typically. They seem to be really obsessed with the idea of stability. Like, that is the thing that they want most in their lives. And I can kind of, come up with a narrative about that, that if you're 5 when the Great Recession happens and your parents lose their house, you're just starting kindergarten. So you're going to remember that. That's going to be a locked together set of memories. And then you're going to be like, 15 to 18 when the pandemic happens, like, woof, you're about to, are you going to college or aren't you going to college? Like that's another kind of core memory kind of moment for you. But I think like, in all fairness, like the 87 stock market crash wasn't so great either. Right. And like the Gulf War I wasn't so great either. And Y2K and 9/11 and the Bush v. Gore, constitutional crisis kind of moment wasn't so great either. Like every generation seems to have these, baby boomers had their own set of them. Early Gen Xers are like coming of age in stagflation. Like, I don't know, like they're children during the Vietnam War. They're, coming out of high school in a period of, high energy prices and an energy crisis. Like, I don't know, every generation seems to have their set of shocks. I don't know why this is unique to millennials and why they get to own these shocks in a specific way, except that I think we're supposed to believe that they happen at kind of formative ages. And so like, that's what really matters here. If you're graduating from college into the recession, which every millennial wants you to know that they did, then like that is your story. And, and I feel like people about my age we had that story for a minute too. Like we all graduated into the .com crash and the Enron fallout. So like, okay, but like you dust yourself off and get on with life, I guess is sort of the difference here. But like we're really hanging on to this story as like, this is why I'm behind.
Nobody gives me credit for it or like says, oh, you're probably like this because your first job happened during the .com crash. Like I don't get any sort of head nod or head pat or pat on the back or any. No one's patting me.
Well, and I also think no one's actually patting the millennials either for this stuff, but boy, are we going to insist on this as like the structure of the narrative. Like everything was going great guns until these core
it's always
traumas.
In paragraph 1 of whatever we're writing think piece about. And so you
Which
did
is
what
predicted
you do
by our guys, right? They're like, into the next generation until something bad happens. And then like, boom, boom, boom.
And like so many parts of what they put in place, Howe and Strauss in Millennials Rising, like so many things that they put in place were kind of like fortune cookie. Oh, you can feel, here's the part of your horoscope. Like something bad will happen. They will be driven until they're not. They could be great or they can become enemies. It's just like all open-ended, see yourself in this writing. And then the media, I hate saying the media, a lot of people in that write influentially sort of said like, oh, this could be the negative thing that they were talking about, or this is where they turn. This is where their identity shifts from we're going to save the world to we're going to overturn the republic or whatever nonsense, or more the economy than the republic.
Yeah. Well, and I think that like, because of that sort of structural, we have to recite these things as core to the narrative, that one of the other things that she kind of calls out as a moment where millennials get to feel older is reflected in some other pieces you and I have been talking on Slack about, which is like these Gen Xer pieces where these like mostly men, Gen Xers of a, you know, somewhere in our age range who are often, you know, writers or academics, and they have suddenly like realized that they're no longer cool. And it really bums them out. And so there's like a nod to that same idea. She says in the piece, the pandemic was also the first time I heard managers fully switch to, quote, those Gen Zers, end quote, as a way to complain about workers being entitled and coddled. Millennials had officially aged out of our status as a cultural anxiety point. It was a relief, of course. Except that I'm not sure the tone of the piece is that it was a relief. It seems like that's the point of angst. Like aging out of our status as a cultural anxiety point is what is making me feel old.
What I liked so much about her writing and this piece in particular is my favorite thing is that she puts in a lot of data points. She adds backup for her points, but really the subtext is really what is most interesting. Like what she's not saying is what you and I have been thinking about more. Of course, you did the thing that you do where you went point by point and found data to like support or rebut her points.
I'm tiresome.
But I think oh, I love it.
I'm a pedant.
But, no, but we were trying to build on her point and try to like take apart her argument. But where we've been going with the conversation about it is more about this idea of like, what even is identity? How do an entire generation of people were assigned an identity, and then what she says, but she doesn't, I don't think she says it so directly, is like the people that have had success, millennials that were able to buy a house and got married and now have kids and seem to have paid off their student debt, have like survivor's guilt. They don't identify as millennials. They're not sure what this means for their life when they should be somewhat satisfied. But of course, capitalism will not allow anybody to be satisfied. But they should be having some of that stability, but instead it makes them question everything, you know, about who they are. And is this the right thing I'm supposed to be doing, or should I still be eating whatever the trendy food is today, according to the New Yorker?
Yeah, I think that my note on the like, you know, no longer being a cultural anxiety point is like one of the sort of patterns we see repeated about any youth generation is that they go through two stages. The first stage is they have not yet gone off to college. They're kids. And these children are representative of hope. They are the future. They're so this, they're so that. They're going to change everything. They're going to save us, right? That is how we feel about children in general.
Yeah.
Is like
Optimism.
Children are the path to progress, is optimistic. And we should feel that way. Like otherwise, I don't know, what are we doing? But then a thing happens where the great majority of them enter the workforce, and we go, oh God, are there enough resources for them? Are there enough resources for them? Will they generate enough resources for both the children we need them to have and the parents we need them to support? like there's a top and a bottom here. Like this cycle continues. And I think what's interesting is ever thus, right? Like I'm not sure there was ever really a moment where anybody looked at Gen Xers and went, they're going to save us. But I haven't done the digging to find it. I'm sure there was some point in time where we were like, you know, the Sesame Street generation, they're going to be amazing. And like, but then it was like, oh, I don't know, drugs, divorce, disease, let's cut them off at the knees and just walk away because we're not going to reclaim this one. And also like the demographic narrative of they were such a smaller generation, even though they were not significantly smaller than the generation before, but they were smaller. And so like that was enough to make people go, well, last generation, walk away from them. The thing that's interesting to me is, as a Gen Xer who remembers the headlines about Gen X and slackers and all of that stuff, and who literally, I'm sure I've said this before, my graduation speech, which I delivered, was about how we really weren't slackers and this was a stupid narrative. So I guess I've been on this, geez, I just realized this is all I've been talking about for 30 years.
That's what makes you an expert.
One note wonder.
I think you should probably qualify for a PhD by now, right?
By this point, surely. just I can have one of those honorary ones, right, where I just get the cap and the gown and a piece of paper, and that's good enough.
Let me make a call. Let me see what I could do here.
Please do. Thank you.
I know a guy.
Thank you. But I think what's interesting is my sense of Gen Xers is the reaction to that story of you're going to be worse off than your parents and you're slackers and don't deserve to be better off than your parents anyway, was met with a collective shrug of like,
Yeah.
okay, whatever. And then,
Yeah.
which is sort of the tone that is ascribed to Gen Xers anyway, is the slogan for the generation is whatever. But like, okay, fine, like you knock yourselves out and then we get on with our lives. What other choice do we have? The difference now is like, oh no, we took that really personally and like adopted it as an identity of like this, that okay, we were entitled and coddled and then we were behind on everything and we're never going to catch up and we're never going to be as well off as our parents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, if you escape that narrative on the ground, right, if your actual experience is not that anymore, then I think it is this weird kind of like, yeah, is it survive? I love the way you put it as like survivor's guilt, because I think that's right. I think that is a big component of it. At least of what she's trying to identify. And then I think, the other part of it is just like, oh, did this story actually ever apply to me? Like,
yeah.
I wonder if some of it is not just like, was this ever true? Was it just a matter of timing? And I think when you look at any of the underlying kind of data points, a lot of it is like they're behind. And it's like, oh, how much behind? Well, we're having children later. How much later? We're buying homes later. How much later? We don't have as much retirement savings. How much? Not as much.
Yes.
Like the degree question matters. Now, I don't want to diminish that, like, yes, it is measurably true that these things are happening later or lesser or whatever. But like, those are part of bigger stories than just what's happening with millennials. And I think even like the data she presents shows us that it's part of a bigger story, but the frame is so tight on just like the millennial experience of it that she can't see the bigger story.
You just delighted me because you crawled in my brain. The framing is everything, right? So if you're telling a ghost story and you start with "it's a dark and stormy night," you're framing the story. Oh, this is a scary story, right? Oh, this group of kids were camping in this deserted forest. Oh, this is a spooky story. Okay, for Gen X, the framing was never "this generation will save us," because boomers did not feel like the country needed to be rescued. When millennials were coming of age, there was this growing group of authors, they weren't called content creators. We didn't manufacture that bullshit for another 20 years. Yeah. But the group of writers and thinkers were starting to say like, oh, I'm seeing cracks in this foundation. This generation will save us. That's how it got framed. And you're correct in Anne Helen Peterson's piece. She is framing based on a pretty narrow idea. And I'm not blaming her for that, for selecting that, but she's picking in at these areas like this. Oh, they were late to homeownership. They were late to marriage. They were late to having children. And that's true, but it's not necessarily correlation causation that because they were millennials, that's why. Mm-hmm. Now, that part got adopted it got assigned to them as an identity, and it got adopted by them as their own identity, that's the most interesting part of the piece. But I don't think it's true that it happened because they were born between 1981 and 1996 alone, and that therefore they had some psychology that said, oh, we will get married later. That's what we've all decided. It's the economy. It's the way. I think you make some great points about women having more freedom and not being plugged into some assigned roles. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you found there? Because when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, like we have to talk about so many things when we talk about millennials or generational culture.
Yeah, I mean, we'll link to some of these things in the show notes, and maybe when we do the edit of this, I'll drop some of the charts I made while waiting for my car to be serviced.
I'm a big fan of these charts.
some of these things. So she sort of lays out the typical formulation, right? She writes, the Great Recession had scrambled or delayed major life events from marriage and parenthood to home ownership and saving for retirement. And so I was like, all right, well, let's go through the list. Like, let's look at marriage. And when you look at marriage data from the census and you look at average age at first marriage data from census. Now, one of the fun things about the census data is that goes from being collected only at the census, so the decennial census. And then they start doing the American Community Survey, where they're surveying frequently, like every year or sometimes even more often, and gathering data on that front. So if you just start with when they really start doing that, which is more or less like 1990, like, yes, it's a big drop off from 1950 to 1990, the big change in the average age, but it's a flat line for the last 30 plus years.
Right.
It's slightly trending in a particular direction of like people are getting older, but it's like it's something like going from, I don't know, 20, the average age being like 23 in 1990 to being 26 today. And if you don't have a college education, it went all the way from 21 to 23. Like that kind of age at first marriage data is, or I may actually be confusing that now with the age of the mother at first birth. But in any event, you're only talking about like over the course of 30 years, like a 2-year delay in the average age at first marriage. Now, you do see differences in the steepness of that pretty flat line, depending on other factors like college degree and also race and ethnicity. The group that is the most stable, just like a flat line over time, there's a lot of wobble in the data, is like Asians. Asians, just like 60% of them are married. Like it's just like, we're done here.
Yeah.
And like, but everybody else is like, African Americans, for structural reasons having nothing to do with their generation, but having to do with redlining and incarceration and Jim Crow and everything else. Like they're starting out with generally lower marriage rates in general. But like, anyway, the basic point here is like, yes, we're getting a little older every year before we get married, but they are really flat lines, slowly declining over time. And so when you look at that, you can't say this is millennials being different from everybody else.
Yeah.
And so what it looks to me like when you look at this longer trend line is this is a longer term trend of delaying marriage or not getting married altogether. And so I just think when you start to see that much longer trend line that starts well before they're even born, well before they've, gone into puberty, well before they've thought about getting married, this is a combination of changing social attitudes about when adulthood begins. Like getting married at 16 is no longer really desirable. Even the idea of you're an adult at 18, increasingly we have people talking about, well, your brain is not fully formed until like 25. And so like, are you really an adult before all of that is done? And then there's that. So then there's just like, when do I feel ready to get married? And that might be a product of jobs, income, location, access to a partner, like any of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then you have like access to contraceptives, increased labor force participation by women, more people pursuing a higher education. You have all of those factors going on, and you also have negative economic pressures. So like pulling it apart and saying, well, it's obviously the Great Recession. Like one of the reasons I want to come back to the flat, slightly declining line is there's not some major change after 2008. Like if we believed that the Great Recession was some major shock, you would expect to see a 2-point, 3-point, 4-point bump. And instead it's just the same steady, imperceptible, change. And so you don't see, marriage rates going up when interest rates come down or when, or marriage rates going up as unemployment rates go down. Like they seem to be trending against all of those kind of economic indicators. And so I wonder if it even is economic. I suspect that it's more of just like a social evolution that we just don't get married at 16 anymore. And so that's pulling the number up in terms of age of first marriage.
Well, there's been context assigned to marriage going back, I don't know, 50 years about what the ideal nuclear family looks like, what the house looks like, how established both partners should be coming into it. That over time has made that idea of let's get married right out of high school less accepted by a lot of Americans. Not that it's right or wrong. I don't give a hoot. But that the idea that I can remember thinking myself, oh, I shouldn't be thinking about getting married yet because I don't have X in the bank, or I don't have a mortgage, or I'm not ready to do those things yet. And therefore this would be step one. Then I'll know. So I think part of it is you can't, and I think she, in her piece, she rightly connects all these pieces. You can't separate them really. The economy and home ownership and job stability, savings, debt, and marriage and having kids they're all connected one way or the other. They're not all a straight line. It's a messy, zigzaggy line, but they're connected because they're all part of culture and they're all pressures that one typically leads to the other, especially across 70 million people.
Absolutely. And we heard that, in Kristen D'Alessandra's research for both genders, but particularly for cis het men, like this sense of I need to be more financially stable, more established before I take on the financial responsibility of a household. Like that is that continues to be present. And what that means varies by your class status. Like what does financial stability mean? Like a solid job might be enough, or I have to have cash in the bank might be enough. It just sort of depends. And yeah, I mean, we ill-advisedly, I think I started rewatching Mad Men a couple days ago, and it is terrible. Talk about a show that shouldn't have been made and can't be made now. Like,
it is a mean
from
show.
The jump.
Yeah, it's mean. You don't even recognize it. I've watched it through twice, and I was like, oh, this show's it's hateful.
Oh, it's so hateful. But yeah, like you think about that, that era and that class, sets of classes of people and the kind of social structures and expectations that are in play about, well, we're young newlyweds, so we must buy an apartment on 86th
Yeah,
Street.
speaking of framing, that show is a masterclass in framing. They show you the 50s and you're like, oh, I know wait a minute, what?
Yes, exactly. And so, I think the other part of the other way that this plays out is in like the parenthood data, which keeps showing like rising ages of mothers mainly, right? So we're having children later is really about women having children later. But like when you actually look at the census data on that, between 1990 and 2019, the fertility rates are pretty stable. Like we're not actually talking about massive changes in births. And you do see a decline that overlaps with the Great Recession, but it starts before the Great Recession. It starts in 2007, and according to the census, is driven largely by non-native Hispanic women who had started to have fewer children starting in 2007. Mm-hmm. So we can't say that this is the recession. Like it was already happening before the recession occurred. And while it then flattened out again to basically pre-recession periods, like it had actually been climbing up through like 2006 to a peak and then started a decline before the recession began. It then flattens back out to where it was in like the late 90s, early aughts, and only dipped again because of the pandemic. And like, obviously. But, the thing that's interesting about that is, one of the things that you wind up conflating in this data is like the average age of women who had a child in the last year. And that number is going up. And it's going up, depending on where you are, kind of significantly. Like you can say like the average age of a mother, a person who gave birth in the last year is like 30 in some places, which is relatively old. But like that's not age at first birth.
That's what I was just going to make sure we clarified.
Yes. Yeah. I want to, when you see that data, just check like, are they talking about age at first birth, or are they just talking about the age of parents, like people who
parent
have
new
just
child,
had a
new
child.
children in general. Yeah.
Yes. Now, underlying this, the stable fertility trend is you do see increased fertility rates. I hate the language of this. Increased fertility rates among older women, and decreased fertility rates among younger women. So I want to be extremely clear that women in their 20s are not infertile. They are putting off motherhood. Because they're
Yeah.
using contraception and abortion where they can get it and all of that, and just, deciding, not taking on a partner or whatever. Like, there are lots of reasons why younger women are not having as many babies, but age of first time mother is still actually in, your 20s. The interesting thing about where the real decline comes from is women 15 to 19. The number of women who are teenagers having babies has just plummeted.
Yeah.
And the number of women who are extending their childbearing years because they either started a little later or they decided to have one more kid, or we just did a project where we met a woman who thought she was going through menopause, and surprise, she's pregnant. And she had not ever actually really planned to have children. She kind of thought she couldn't, and she can. So, poor thing. But she's like 45 and she's going, now I have to reorganize my whole life. So, things are happening. But the other thing that happens is, like, people get married, then they get divorced, and they get remarried, and they may not have had a child in the first marriage. They have
Right.
one in the second marriage. I mean, and that's also not new. My dad was married before he married my mother. They had a child, and then several years passed, and he's married to a new person and has new kids. And there's a big gap between all of us because of those changes. And then I have other friends who, parents got together and then dad goes off and serves in the military, or dad's incarcerated for a period of time. And then when he gets out, that's when the second kid happens. And so there's a 10-year gap sometimes between children now. And not now, ever been thus. But so one of the things to kind of bear in mind is there's a lot of anxiety about women having children later, but and all that focus is on the women who are waiting to be in their late 30s or early 40s to have kids. Most of those people are second-time moms. That's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know is the real drop-off in young women fertility rates is the teenagers, because we have decided as a society to say we would prefer that teenagers did not have children. We don't think they're prepared for it. We don't think it's a great start to a child's life. We don't think it's a great way to spend your teenage years. We have extended, with the invention of teenagers, we have changed when adulthood begins. And so adulthood begins after you graduate from high school, and probably after you graduate from college in certain class strata. And so no, 15 is not a great age to have a kid. Right. And so we have as a society decided, abstinence education, contraception, and just social norms that say we don't do that. That's the main driver of that. It's not the Great Recession. Right? And again, that's a long-term downward trend that has been steep and, and consistent over time. And that's what's driving that change in age. So it's not specific to you, millennials. This has been going on for a while. So you're not alone. And also, you're not alone, I feel like, is the new, it's not about you.
It's a much more polite way to say it.
You're not alone feels a little bit like bless your heart to me. Yeah. But anyway, you're not alone. And it's, it's not really anything to freak out about. And also, it's fine if you don't want to have kids. One of the other things that we should note is this feels like an American story because we focus so much of the millennial narrative on the US, and we're going to try to push out against that in coming episodes. But the truth is that most industrialized nations have declining birth rates as more women gain education, more women move into the workforce, as people decide to be more intentional, let's say, about how they want their lives to progress. And so there is sort of an argument to be made that that one of the other things about that is those countries are populous. They're populous and wealthy. And so at a certain kind of sort of fulcrum of population size and relative wealth, you can't sustain a lot more population. And so like there may just be a kind of local maxima about that sort of thing. And now that creates anxiety among people like your Neil House about the places where there are a lot of young people. And those places tend to be, or often are, places that are not quite as developed economically, and also that have, you know, had a lot of turmoil. But more importantly, for those narratives, like you have to just like look them dead in the eye and understand that what they're concerned about is it's the brown people who are having a lot of children, and that's what's freaking us out.
Right. The authors of the concern are
Yes.
coming from a different place. What their concern is like, oh, but they're
Yes.
not us. Therefore, how do we undo some of the things that are
Yes.
pushing the age
Exactly.
forward here?
Yeah. But, you know, in the meantime, being like freaked out about the average age of mothers shifting from 21 in 1972 to 26 in 2018 is like, first of all, that's a pretty slow drift over time. The other thing about that is that increase in age is mostly among married women, college educated women, and left leaning women. If you don't have a college degree, if you tend to be more conservative, if you're unmarried, you're still more likely to have children younger.
Right.
And so if we're not immediately like moving, if a woman is no longer moving from her father's house to her husband's house, then lots of things can happen in the meantime. And only, you know, it's only one possibility that you might have a child. So, you know, I think if nothing else, we cannot go back to going back to Anne Helen's sort of initial sort of establishing premise. We can't say that parenthood is being delayed by the Great Recession.
Right.
It's being delayed by a lot of things, and it's not just millennials.
And when you look at national means and medians across an entire population, or even in cases where they break it out by generational measures, which thank you, Anne Helen Peterson, for giving us a beginning and an end to your definition of what the millennial generation is. Which now I'm looking at one of these other charts and it's not the same years. It's based on their age. And I don't know if that means today or at the time of the poll or whatever the data was gathered. So now I'm confused. But when you're looking nationally, then to go back to the beginning of our conversation, that idea of identity is, well, how do I plug myself into, what am I reacting to? Am I reacting to the average of the median American, the median millennial? What even is millennial? Who set the years in that particular study that I'm supposed to be pinging off of?
Yes.
So.
Yes. Why are we comparing 40-year-olds to 80-year-olds? Stop it.
Right. Or 40-year-olds to 30-year-olds.
It's just.
Who gives a hoot?
Well, and this is one of the things too when you start looking at like the homeownership and retirement savings data.
That's what I'm looking
like you see this big change, right? Like from like 2015 to 2023, all of a sudden millennials are better off than they were on multiple economic metrics. And it's like an interesting thing happened between 2015 and 2023. And stay with me, it's complicated. You lived 8 more years. like honestly, I mean, it's a thing that I think about a lot. Like, I mean, to quote Gwen Stefani, no, but like the kind of the Saturn return is a real thing. Like every 7 years, your life is quite different than it was 7 years before. Being a 7-year-old and a 14-year-old, really different. Being 14 and 21, really different. Being 21 and 28, really different. Maybe not as different as between 21 and 24 or 14, but like then between being 28 and 35, hugely different. Between 35 and 42, hugely different.
I'm
like
seeing
congratulations. Like you got older, you worked in your career longer, you had more time to save money, you were further away from the expenses that put you in debt in the first place, your car got paid off in that period of time, maybe you finished paying your undergraduate loan in that period of time. Like all of those things take time and a certain amount of like, I don't know, maybe this is also part of why I don't spend a lot of time the only degree to which I care about aging is like, I don't want to be in a lot of pain as an old person. Like that's it.
Yeah.
That's all I really care about. So the things I am doing now to try to stave off pain later, that's the thing that I'm concerned about. But most things are just like, would it have been nice to have a certain amount of money in my 20s? Sure. But that's not most people's 20s because you're in your 20s. Like, unless you have parent money, most people aren't making it big in their 20s. And like, that's fine. It's your 20s. In your 30s, things might start to shift. And by the time you're in your 40s, you'll either have like figured out whatever your situation is, and that's middle class, or that's affluent, or that's something else. But like, some of this is just a product of maturity and time. And so there's that. The interesting thing about like age of first-time homeownership is like, one of the first pieces of information I found was like average mortgage debt by generation. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is that a big part of the narrative amongst millennials about homeownership is partly the Great Recession, and partly some idea that like baby boomers are selfishly parking themselves in their single family homes that they own outright and have no debt on, and not freeing them up as housing stock for millennials to buy.
How dare they remain in those homes that they bought?
I know, the audacity.
Paid off.
Yeah. Yeah. The absolute audacity. And so like, but so first of all, one of the things I would say here is the average mortgage debt by generation, according to this Experian study, has baby boomers with, as of Q3 2020, with $178,000, almost $179,000 in average mortgage debt, which is they're only about $50,000 ahead in the sense of less than like millennials. And like, which is fascinating because Gen X is actually the group that's the worst off in terms of average mortgage debt.
Most debt, yeah.
So that is not to say that mortgage debt isn't, a burden. It absolutely is. But it is also like...
it's a constructive burden.
It's a constructive burden, hopefully. And also it is part of everyone's experience. I mean, silent generation, 75 plus, their average mortgage debt in Q3 2020 was $134,000. You're over 75 and you still owe money on your home is not part of the popular narrative. The popular narrative is you're 60 and over, it's all cash. Like, that is practically a liquid asset for you now. And you should just like relinquish it. Like, sell it to somebody else, but not at too much of a margin, please. And so I just wanted to deal with that first, because I think one of the things that drives me crazy about the millennial narrative is I think it is held in contrast to the boomer narrative. And the current boomer narrative is they are hoarders of money and of wealth. And so they are sitting on all of this wealth, both in real property and in, stock and cash and everything else. And like, this is what is holding millennials back. There is a thread of the narrative that has that in it. And we should probably just do the state of the boomers episode at some point, because it's not that rosy. Like, boomers are just as likely to not have the $500 in emergency money as anybody else. They have a lot of mortgage debt. They do not have sufficient retirement savings as a generation.
Now, Farah,
it is a problem.
You might not know this. The millennials alone experienced the Great Recession. Boomers did not. It passed right past them. So those that already had retirement savings, it went untouched. Their house values did not change or decline in any meaningful way, because they just got the questionnaire that said, are you Gen X or a boomer? And they said boomer. And so the recession was like, oh, pass.
Yes.
We're just going to go right past you and bother your kids. Like, what are we talking about? Why do we make that expectation we put on boomers that is like, oh, it's only been a hockey stick for them for 50 years. And again, since we're talking about what is probably 60 million people, there's one version of that story, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
story. It's just like exceptional growth. They're all founders of their own startups that are on the NASDAQ.
Right. Right. Once
They're probably
again,
not.
yeah, once again, we're focused on the white, upper middle class, college educated boomers. Like that's
Right.
who we're talking about once again. And even that story is not like a uniform story, as it isn't with millennials. But then, so then it was like, okay, so once again, everybody's got some mortgage debt. Even Gen Z has mortgage debt. And I just want to say props to you kids for going ahead and getting that mortgage debt early. I think, as I said in my note, congrats, you'll never be free again. So like, what are you doing? But good for you, I guess. The I found some other data from an American Housing Survey tabulated by the U.S. Census that showed number of first-time home purchases and the rate of first-time home buying. And like it's a chart from 97 to, I don't know, 2017. And so again, you're looking for that big drop off after 2008, right? Like home buying plummeting after 2008. Except that's a carts and horses problem, my friends, because the drop off happens in 2006 and 2007
Mm-hmm.
because that's what caused the Great Recession.
Yeah.
Homeownership was flat, suddenly rising, but high through the late 90s into 2005. And then it starts to plummet because of the frothy housing market. It was too expensive to get into the market in 2005, 2006, 2007.
Yep.
And so you start to see the drop off there. And the drop off is part of what starts to cause the housing crisis. It's
100%.
like, oh, these houses are not moving the way they used to. And like, so there's like a cause and effect problem here of like, you're not buying fewer homes because of the Great Recession. We had the Great Recession because people were buying fewer homes.
Yes. But we want to tell the story the same way.
Right.
And
All
we also
these things have to be explained by this one factor.
Yeah, and we want to tell the story so that millennials are the villains who may either, depending on the part of the article, the first part will say they were the victims of the Great Recession, and then the next part will say they killed the housing market.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of those things are true.
No.
I mean, they suffered, but they didn't suffer more or less than other people.
Yeah. Securitization of the mortgage market. That's the problem.
Right.
Right. Like,
and home buyer greed, investor greed at that point. Like,
like
should home prices have risen 80%, year over year in 2005? Maybe that's not great.
I know it will
lesson
make
learned.
amazing merch at some point for us to have a tote bag or a t-shirt that just says generations obliterate systems. Like, it's just every time you're trying to tell me a story about generations, I'm like, I think there's a systems answer here. Yeah. I think the thing you're talking about is the net effects of the war on drugs, or the net effects of securitization of mortgages, or the net effects of whatever. Like there's a million other things. Like it's just always like, if you start the clock at 2001 and only look there, then you're going to see one part of a story and not the rest of it. If you only look at the people born between, if you kind of set your parameters where I'm only looking at this age group and I'm only looking from this year on, then it looks like maybe there's a story there, except for this 2008 thing, which is like everything changed in 2008. And it's like, I'm not seeing it. Like, yeah. I appreciate that it was a huge shock. It was a huge shock in my family too.
Sure.
But it didn't actually change much about the overall economy and the overall experience of these people. And even in looking at like age of first-time homebuyers, that took a minute to try to track down, but that has gone all the way from 32 in 1997 to 34 in 2017. Like there's a lot of wobble in that data. Also, it goes up and down depending on home prices and the general state of the economy. Like, you're not seeing a huge change in the age distribution of first-time home buyers over time. The largest change is in the share of buyers who were 35 to 54 between 97 and 2013, which is not millennials. Like, they're not 35 in 1997.
Right.
They're not even 35 in 2013 necessarily. Some of them, no. Even then, I don't think that they've made it there. We're talking about the latter half of the baby boom generation and Gen X that are experiencing that larger decline, the 5% drop. And so, like, in 2009, the average age of a first-time homebuyer was younger than it was for Gen Xers at the same stage of life. And so, like, you just see, like, you know, the current age of a homebuyer, according to the National Association of Realtors, if you can believe them, their embroidered scandal, is like 33. So it's just like, I don't know, 30 to 34 is about when people buy their first home on average. And that's just been a kind of stable number for 30 years.
Right.
And so, okay, I know it feels bad. I know you maybe aspired to have more. For some reason, you thought you were going to have more. I possibly blame books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad. But, like, that's not how it was happening, and it's not how it has happened. And trying to pin it on the Great Recession is just ahistorical. I don't know how else to put it. Like, it's just not borne out in the freaking data.
It's what the kids call wrong.
Oh, yes. That is the word for it.
I'm hip with the lingo, Farrah. I don't know if you knew that.
My favorite thing, though, is the retirement savings data.
Yeah.
Because the millennials are out here in these streets, out here on Beyonce's internet, telling us how much they are going to suffer in retirement.
It doesn't
and
look,
that's just not what the data says
either.
either.
The case. Yeah.
And some of it is they joined the workforce at a point in time where there was way more, like, nudge work being done about getting people to enroll in 401k plans. So, like, you had to opt out of a 401k when they entered the.
I love that. That's the only, like, meaningful nudge. Like, all that work.
The only thing that worked.
The only example people have is, like, it's pre-selected that you sign up for a 401k. That's how nudges work. It's like, give me a second one, and then 10 minutes go by, and they're like, the first one's pretty good, though. You got to admit. You're like, all right, yeah, that's a good one.
No, listeners, I refer you to If Books Could Kill episode about this. It's mostly nonsense. It's mostly ad campaigns, except for the auto enrollment in 401k plans. Like,
very successful.
And even then, like, it's a little dodgy. Yeah. But I think one of the things that you had was such a strong narrative that millennials were going to be screwed come retirement time. We have had since really Reagan a story about how Social Security is headed for bankruptcy. It's not going to be there for you.
Right.
And baby boomers felt really over a barrel about that because pensions had gone away. Like, with the advent of the 401k, pensions went away. And also baby boomers were more likely to change jobs more frequently and change employers more frequently, even change whole career fields more frequently than previous generations. And so they were going to get kind of screwed. And they have gotten kind of screwed on that level. Late baby boomers across the income percentiles are the worst off, generally speaking, in terms of having enough to replace their income in retirement. And so, like, you look at the data on this, and, like, if you're in the 25th percentile of income, basically millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers are all kind of tied. They are definitely need to get to, like, 96% spending needs, and they're at 64%. Like, they've got a ways to go before they're going to catch up, if they're ever going to catch up. And if you're a boomer, you're not going to catch up. If you get up into the 95th percentile, however, millennials are basically there. Like, they're already locked. They're at, like, 89% of the savings needed to be able to replace their income in retirement.
Yeah.
And boomers are still down at 63%. Like, and in those kind of middle tiers of 50th, 70th percentiles, like, boomers are like 50% of the way there. Like,
that story will start to emerge in the next 5 years.
Yes. And so what we're looking at here is a class story, not a generational story.
Don't you dare. Don't you dare suggest.
This is about class. Once again, I rear my Marxist little head and tell you this is a class problem.
I think the other thing about this data you pointed out, that it talks about early millennials, Gen X,
Yeah. There's
the middle group, and then
weird
late
gaps in this.
boomers,
Yeah.
which that kind of tells me they leave out 10-year gaps in between, or 8-year gaps in between the two
Mm-hmm.
groups or the three groups, which I bet then if you look at the continuum of all the data, it's not as dramatic as that
Probably
95th or
not.
25th.
Probably more
Yeah.
of a gradient. Yes. But like, it is actually a good news story for millennials that they have opted into their 401ks, that they have set aside money for that. I mean, you hear a lot of anecdotal stories about millennials foregoing home ownership in
Mhm.
favor of contributing more to their 401k or setting aside money into an IRA or some other retirement savings account.
And again, we keep talking about systems, but we also talk about framing, and that's a framing question. That is somebody positioning the story that not buying a home is bad
Mm-hmm.
if people are putting money into a retirement account, which is arguably like that's just a different strategy to
Yeah.
saving.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't know if it's good or bad. We won't know for 50 years. We'll find out together. But if you
Yes.
can't afford to buy a house, then you still want to save. Yeah, throwing it in an IRA is not a bad idea. Like,
Well, and there I have not dug into this yet, but I have started to read some things about, one of the big things about the German economy, for example, is there's not as high of a rate of home ownership as in other OECD countries. So people just generally don't buy homes. They rent, and they rent their whole lives. And that means in general that like they have income for other things. And so we do projects with German counterparts and in Germany, and like they take the whole month of August off, and they take nice vacations. They travel widely. They're quite entrepreneurial. They have a pretty good industrial base. Like their productivity numbers are very good. Like economically, Germany is sound, except on the homeownership metric. Now they also have a social safety net and that sort of thing, so we have to set that aside from the US as usual.
yeah,
But what millennials are doing is saying, all right, you told us that you weren't going to give us a social safety net except for this marginally tax advantaged instrument, and so I guess I'll take advantage of the marginally tax advantaged instrument.
yeah,
And you're absolutely right. We'll see how it turns out later. We'll also see like how long do housing prices stay this high in relationship to income. But like we just have to kind of move on, I think, from this story. And if that is making some millennials feel old, that they have to move on from this story, that they don't have enough retirement savings, that they don't have, that they're not homeowners, that they're not married, that they don't have kids, whatever, that they did all of this stuff late, then like, I don't know. I'm going to be super Gen X about this and say, get over it. Like, first of all, it's not really what's happened. And secondly, if you're in that group that she identifies where you realize that that is not how your life turned out, you did get married, you did buy a house, you do have retirement savings, you do have a good job and decent income, and you have kids, then like, does that make you not a millennial?
who gives a shit?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. Who cares?
But like,
Honestly, who cares?
you just listed off like all the life goals of your average American, and like you've achieved all those things. Should you feel bad that you're not in the group anymore? I'm not sure it matters.
It's a little wild. Like, it's a little wild to be like, oh, I guess I'm not young anymore because young was this narrative of struggle. And
But
I think that's really weird. Like, I have
but
to
didn't
say,
you
like,
have that feeling when you were in your 20s and living in a city, and that feeling of struggle is just kind of part of 21 to 29 of like, okay, I got to be resourceful and figure out how I'm going to stretch this paycheck, or now I got to figure out how I'm going to get that next job. Like that struggle story is just part of that age. I think it's
yes,
figuring out what being a grown up is.
yes. But I feel like something happened where millennials came to, or some group of millennials, people with Substacks, um, came to believe that like their trajectory, their destiny was to have all this stuff nailed down early. Like that they were going to be homeowners like at whatever the median ages are, they were going to have it locked down. So if the
Right.
median age of first time home ownership is 30, at 30 I should own a home. If the
Yeah,
average
yeah.
age of a first time parent is 26, at 26 I should be married and have a kid. Like those stories I think got sold, and they bought it and then went, well, what happened? I'm behind. But I wonder if also part of it is the A for effort, everybody gets a trophy, helicopter parenting, achievement oriented, individualistic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, parts of their the early part of the story when they were the next greatest generation, that they're carrying the baggage of that they have some cultural memory of when the expectations for them were extremely high, and that they felt they weren't meeting those expectations because they graduated
Now
into
they
a
don't.
crappy job market
But
and
now they're in the
whatever.
winner's circle and they don't know what to do.
Yeah, they're back where they were when they were children. Like,
But
you made
I have a
it.
question. Do you think, maybe we're not being hard enough even on the hypothesis of the piece. I'm scrolling through it now. Do we know for sure that this group of people that has this identity challenge, does this
Exists.
exist?
No,
Right?
no.
I mean,
Yeah,
she cites the article by Zach Barron, which is a nice article.
yeah, about feeling washed. Yeah.
But it's like one person's somewhat well written piece about reflecting on seeing Jay-Z on stage. Like, okay. Yeah, it does feel old. Like if I went and saw Guns N' Roses, I would feel pretty old because I'm looking at people that were in their 20s when I was 14 and they're 60 and I'm 50. Like, yeah, I feel old because we both got older. Not because I bought a house and achieved these things. It's just like time passed, as to your earlier point.
I went to a Pogue show in Greenwich
Oh,
Park.
sweet baby Jesus. Yeah, they were on walkers, right?
Just about.
They were
But,
like,
I had
the
to.
concession stand was like beer, Mylanta. It's like,
I mean, it was amazing because like seeing old punks is one of my favorite things. Like old
yeah,
punks are the best. And
yeah.
like you're 65 years old and you're sleeved and your hair is blue and not like Blue Rand's old lady blue, like blue. And
Yeah.
I'm like, that's great. That's great. That's
Yeah.
great.
Except for Iggy Pop, who like still is ripped. He's how is this happening?
That guy's amazing.
He's a freak.
He's amazing.
Absolutely.
But yes, I'm unconvinced that there's a lot of these people who feel this way. I think most people just kind of muddle along in their lives and are not spending a lot of time reflecting on survivor's guilt about no longer being in the lost generation, as Annie Lowry called it in her piece in The Atlantic. Like, this is a narrative among a very particular group of people who like went to the right schools and got the right jobs in journalism, right? And the problem with going to the right schools and then getting the right jobs in journalism is, yeah, there's always going to be a pretty big gap between your income and your student loan debt. Sorry to say, like, as good as the New York Times may pay, it's not good enough to pay back those Yale student loans. And so sorry about that, guys. But like making a whole cultural narrative out of it does feel a little silly. I'm going to say it's a little silly. But I don't know. Like until you were to do some kind of widespread survey about it, I don't know.
Yeah, or to talk to Anne Helen Peterson. Like I hope we're able to get her to connect to her, and because I bet there's things that didn't make the piece.
Yeah.
To talk about that inform her point of view. That it's just not in the writing.
Well, and I think they're based on a lot of her other work, and I think it's a compelling idea, and it's like I would love to dig into that more and find out, like, besides that piece about feeling washed, where else is she seeing that show up and amongst whom? I think the other one that's kind of interesting, though, even if you go back to her breakdown of like people who really identified with the millennial narrative and have now achieved the things that the millennial narrative said they would never achieve, people who identify or don't with the millennial narrative but are still not achieving the things that they were told they would not achieve and kind of are stuck in that tier, and then the group of people who like never were part of the millennial narrative and I guess don't really care. That I still don't know what that third one is, but like the thing about that, if you just set aside that group, the exennial part of it, if you have those other two groups, what you are essentially talking about is people who are upwardly mobile and people who are not.
Mm-hmm.
I bet
and
you.
So she validates the upwardly mobile part, but she does not validate their feelings. She sort of makes an assumption that they feel like they don't identify because they've been upwardly mobile. And so that's where we call survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, I'm right where I'm supposed to be. Do they feel more satisfied with their identity? I would argue they feel less happy overall.
Right. And that's kind of, she's saying that too, of like, it's exhausting to not be able to get to the next step.
True.
But I also think that baked into that idea is that everybody wants to get to the next step or thinks they can or should. Like, there are, you know,
It's the drive that we talked about earlier.
exactly. Like, so I grew up in suburban Portland, but I grew up like on the west side of Portland, where a little bit further out and it's all agricultural. And so you have a lot of kids growing up on farms. You have a lot of children of farm workers. And then you have all these kids whose parents either work in like the professional class or in tech. Like that was where I went to high school. Like that was your makeup. Um, and so like, there were friends of mine in high school who like got their GED and dropped out because they needed to go work in their dad's auto body shop. Or needed to work on the farm. There were plenty of kids I knew who like, I knew them because they like were in the band and played football and whatever. And so, a lot of time in the stands in the pep band having to chat with them. And they like inherited the family tree farm and that's what they do now. And like, they might be doing pretty well. They might be getting by and doing just fine. But I don't know that they're looking at their lives and going, I really wish I'd gotten an office job as a content creator. Or that I'd gone to work in finance or that I'd went to college or whatever that they did or didn't do. As long as they're pretty happy in their lives, like there are people that I know who did not go to college, who got married pretty young, who had kids pretty young, who are millennials, who are now finally homeowners in their early 40s, who are trying to figure out how they're going to afford college with their kids. Because their kids are going to go to college. And like, I don't think they spend a ton of time lamenting not having gone to college themselves. I don't think they feel bad about in their early 40s being able to buy a home because they were able to buy the home. Now they have it. Like they can do all sorts of fun stuff with it. Like, and they're resourceful people with actual skills. Like, so I don't know. I think we're assigning to the people who are in a lower class status than the first group, which is not to say that they're low class, but that they're not the professional class with bachelor's degrees. We're assigning to that group of people a sense of dissatisfaction with the state of things. And I think there is almost certainly some, and then almost certainly lots of people who don't feel that way. And that's because that group of people is the majority. Like that group of people is most people. Yeah. Most people still don't have a college degree. Most people still are not above that $150,000 a year threshold. They're at the median or below. And like that's the distribution of income and education in this country. And so you're talking about that second group, but like you don't relate to that second group because you're not in it. You're in the first group. Right. You're in the group.
And I think those three groups those three groups she presents are probably just to start 9 groups. And then
at least
then what do you do? Like, how do you strive them further? And is it productive to do so?
Well, and that of course is, as you and I know well, like anytime you're doing a segmentation, the question is to what end? Like, what would you do differently for these different groups of people?
You know what might be interesting because she gives us so much economic data and like familial data, and then you just read through a lot that you pulled to build on it. I wonder if we could go start looking at the happiness studies and start to look at that and see if there's what we could mine out of that. Maybe I'll take that action as a future episode or future mini series about trying to understand, because that's what she's talking about is life satisfaction, happiness index, this concern that people are disconnected or becoming unmoored from happiness as they achieve things that they were told they wouldn't achieve. I wonder if that's true. I wonder if this data exists or if we'd have to produce our own study.
That's interesting. And I think one of the things I would add to that is, right off the top, as she starts to talk about the Zach Barron piece in GQ, is like the idea of that, like, what does she say? It's not about being the locus of cool. You just seem to matter less, she says. And I'm like, for one thing, like, welcome to the discourse of middle-aged women. Like, it has long been true that, like, once you are past your prime, meaning no longer having children, marketers don't care about you. Like, and to the extent that they do, they're selling you menopause and incontinence products because they assume that you've skipped right ahead to 75 and your uterus is prolapsed. Like, that's the assumption. And like, so welcome to the part where you get ignored by marketers. In my mind, this story is a really this piece, and just, for listeners, it is called How Millennials Grew Up and Got Old. It's on Culture Study on Substack, and like it is fascinating because it is like holding up a mirror to the cult of the young that marketing has always been so central to. And I think like the thing I just constantly come back to is it really feels to me like the thing that makes millennials different from previous youth generations is they were sold a story about who they were and how they were going to be and how they were, and like, and all the aesthetics that went with that and all the products that went with that and all the behaviors that went with that. And they bought it. And now that marketers have said, yeah, we don't really care about you, on to the next.
Yeah.
Like, that is unmooring. If you were in a previous generation where they never really quite knew what to do with you anyway, have a Coke and teach the world to sing, and then, whatever, buy an Oldsmobile. Right. Like and so I wonder also if we shouldn't look at some of the ways that the marketing industry has changed in the way that it focuses on youth.
If only we knew people in that industry.
I just don't know where we would start.
I'll go to LinkedIn and see what I can find.
Okay.
I've heard there's a marketing expert, millennial marketing expert. I'll just type that in. I'll be one or two answers.
Yeah. But I think to your initial question, like, it would be really interesting to find out something. Maybe the happiness study has some clues about this, of like what is really causing the dissatisfaction in this cohort, and like, and which parts of the cohort. Because even some of the happiness data I've seen, like the things that are driving people's dissatisfaction seem very white collar to me. And like, I wonder if it isn't like the college educated white collar folks are the ones experiencing the most ennui in their professional lives because of the way the economy is currently structured, that doesn't really favor them as much as it used to. Or
well, like, I think it does, that's what but I think that's what her article is describing, that person, and ennui is the exact word that she's describing, which is like, I used to, like a starving artist or somebody who wins the lottery. You hear the urban legend, like they win the lottery and they move out of their trailer and they're miserable and they kill themselves. And it's like, actually that never happened.
Right.
But I understand the point of the story, I guess, Yeah.
Yeah.
The dad is here, but I don't know that the story's right.
Yeah. I mean, it's also funny that like repeating generational things of like, I don't know, some of it's also just like, welcome to the show, like, oh, the things you wore when you were a teenager, the Delia's catalog or whatever is now showing up on your doorstep again, essentially, but for your preteen daughter. Like,
sorry,
well, okay. Like that happened to my mother multiple times. It will happen.
You have to buy a bigger pant size. Like, this is just what happens.
Right. Yes. Like, or you could choose to do something else. Like, you could just choose to like leave your 90s fashions in the 90s and move on to some other thing entirely as the grown ass person that you are.
I wear exclusively flannels, as you know.
Flannels. I mean, it's true. All the older Gen Xers I know, particularly like the rocker ones, they're still out there in their Z Cavaricis, doing and members only jackets.
Bless you. God bless you. All right. I think let's
Should we end it there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Giving the Zoomers something to Google.
If someone mentions like Jinkos or Cavaricis, that's the end of the episode. From now on, like, even if it's the second minute, if a guest makes a joke about it, it's like, all right, well, thanks for coming on. We'll see you later. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I think we have some fun follow-ups to do that'll materialize in upcoming episodes. So this was great. I'm glad we were able to do this. I think I might enjoy these episodes more. I love talking to our guests and learning from them, but sometimes when we just get to really dive in and kick these things around, I think it's more enjoyable. I feel a little less pressure. We can just think out loud.
It's true. I mean, these conversations are fun. And also, like, I want to be clear that, like, I think she's an amazing writer and a keen observer of things that she's seeing on the internet. And so clearly, like, this conversation is happening. I think the thing about it is, like, the conversation is built on a whole other story that's mostly nonsense. and I don't know, maybe I'm now on a kind of a mission to free millennials from the bonds of this crazy narrative that says that you're behind. babies, you're not fine. You're not behind. You're doing just great.
Yeah.
Doing just great,
We love
sweetie.
you. Fair and I love you.
We love you. It's going to be okay.
All right. We'll talk again soon.
All right. In the Demo is produced by Farah Bostic and Adam Pierno with support from the Difference Engine, and edited by Allison Preisinger and AMP Studio. Music by Omega Man under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research and supporting information. Please rate and review the show. Someone told us that helps.